The soft hum of Jocelyn's sewing machine filled the tiny back room of her office, stitching delicate lace onto the hem of an ivory veil. She paused, letting the needle rest, and traced her fingers along the intricate fabric. It was beautiful, of course, elegant, perfect, just like everything else in her wedding planning business had to be. Yet, as she sat alone in the quiet, surrounded by swatches of satin and color-coded planners, she felt the familiar weight settle on her chest. She glanced at the vision board by her desk, a mosaic of smiling couples, Pinterest-worthy centerpieces, and handwritten thank you notes from brides and grooms. "You make dreams come true," one card read. But the words felt hollow today, like they often did lately. Jocelyn leaned back in her chair and exhaled, closing her eyes. Dreams. She'd built a career out of them, orchestrating love stories, choreographing first dances, and perfecting every last detail of someone else's fairy tale. Yet, whenever she thought about what love really looked like, truly felt like, she struggled to recall the last time she'd believed in it for herself. The office door creaked as her assistant popped her head in. "Jocelyn, the Callaway reception is asking for another change to the seating chart, again. Apparently they've decided Cousin Finn isn't family enough for the head table." Jocelyn managed a small smile. "Of course. Send it over and I'll fix it." The assistant nodded and disappeared, and Jocelyn stared at her desk. Another change, another demand, another carefully curated event tied up with ribbons and bows. But beneath the surface of it all, the champagne toasts, the choreographed entrances, the floral arches, there was always something missing. She'd see it in the strained smiles of mothers-in-law or the distracted glances exchanged between couples too preoccupied with the perfect day to notice each other. It gnawed at her, this creeping sense that the love she spent her life staging was, more often than not, a performance. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. A notification blinked across the screen. "Intimate concert tonight, 8 p.m. Tickets still available." Jocelyn's lips parted slightly as she read the words. She'd seen the flyer earlier that week, pinned to a coffee shop bulletin board. A small, intimate venue. No elaborate light shows, no theatrics, just raw, honest music. She bit her lip, her heart quickening as the thought lingered. It had been too long since she'd let herself drift into something purely for her. Too long since she'd let herself feel. Without hesitating further, she grabbed her coat and headed for the door. The unfinished veil could wait. The Callaway seating chart could wait. Tonight, for a few hours, she could escape the world of pristine ceremonies and promises. Tonight, she could lose herself in music, the one place where love still felt real. The venue was smaller than Jocelyn expected, tucked away on a quiet side street with a hand-painted sign that simply read, "The Haven." She hesitated in front of the door, her breath fogging in the cool night air. Faint chords of a guitar drifted out, mingling with laughter from those already inside. Her fingers brushed over the ticket in her coat pocket as she exhaled and stepped in. The space invited her in like a warm embrace. String lights hung loosely across the wooden beams, casting a golden glow over the intimate room. A few mismatched chairs and tables were scattered around, but most people had settled onto the wide, worn rugs stretched across the floor. At the far end of the room, a makeshift stage had been set up, no more than a low platform with a microphone stand and a stool. The performer sat there now, his head bowed slightly as his fingers coaxed an achingly beautiful melody from his guitar. Jocelyn stood still for a moment, letting it wash over her. It wasn't just the music, it was the way the room seemed to breathe with it. No one was scrolling on their phones or whispering over the sound. Everyone was present, as if held under the same spell. Jocelyn found herself smiling softly, feeling the tension she carried begin to loosen. She moved to the back of the room, slipping into an open spot on the floor, her coat bunched beneath her. The singer's voice rose, unpolished yet raw, and brimming with sincerity. His lyrics were simple, intimate, the kind that made you feel as though he'd cracked open his chest and let you see inside. Jocelyn closed her eyes, drawing her knees up to her chest. For the first time in what felt like weeks, she wasn't thinking about timelines or color palettes or seating charts. She was simply here. The applause was gentle but earnest as the first performer finished. He thanked the audience, stepping off the stage with a shy smile. Jocelyn opened her eyes and clapped along before glancing around. The crowd was diverse, students, couples, older regulars, but somehow they all fit together. She caught sight of a man moving through the back of the room, and for reasons she couldn't quite explain, her gaze lingered. He was tall, with an easy, effortless confidence to the way he carried himself. His dark curls fell slightly into his face, and his sleeves were rolled up, revealing hands that looked both strong and precise. He paused by the small counter in the corner to pour himself a cup of tea, his movements deliberate and graceful. It wasn't until he turned and caught her looking that Jocelyn realized she'd been staring. She quickly looked down, her cheeks warming, but not before noticing the faint curve of a smile on his lips. The next performer was introduced, but Jocelyn found it harder to focus this time. She felt a subtle awareness of someone nearby and glanced up to find the same man now leaning against the wall not far from her. He had a soft, attentive expression as he listened to the music, his head tilting slightly with the rhythm. Jocelyn shifted, staring at the stage, but her thoughts kept drifting back to him. When the song ended and the audience broke into applause, the man clapped along before leaning down slightly toward her. "It's nice, isn't it?" His voice was low, warm, with the kind of cadence that invited you to lean in. Jocelyn blinked, caught off guard. "The music?" He nodded, his brown eyes meeting hers. Honest, no polish, no pretense, just real. She smiled, her earlier shyness melting a bit. "That's why I came," she admitted, "to feel something real." He studied her for a moment, as if weighing her words, then extended his hand. "Lucas, Jocelyn." She hesitated only a fraction of a second before taking his hand. His grip was firm but not overbearing, his touch warm against hers. "First time here?" he asked, releasing her hand as he leaned back against the wall. She nodded. "Yeah. I saw a flyer and thought I'd give it a try." "Well, you picked a good night," Lucas said, his eyes crinkling slightly at the corners. "The Haven tends to draw the kind of performers who aren't afraid to bare their soul a little." "That's rare these days," Jocelyn said, her voice softening. "Everything's so polished and curated, it's like people forget how to just feel." Lucas tilted his head, watching her with quiet curiosity. "You sound like someone who spends a lot of time around things that aren't real." She let out a small laugh, surprised by how close he'd come to the truth. "You could say that." Before she could elaborate, the next performer began, and the room fell quiet again. Jocelyn turned her gaze to the stage, but she was acutely aware of Lucas beside her, his presence grounding yet electric all at once. As the music swelled, she found herself wondering how a chance encounter, in a place as unassuming as this, could already feel so significant. The night had deepened by the time the last performer stepped off the stage. The applause was warm and lingering, the kind that didn't want to let go of the magic just yet. Slowly, people began to stir, gathering their coats and murmuring quietly to one another, reluctant to leave the cocoon of music that had wrapped itself around them. Jocelyn remained seated on the floor, her legs tucked beneath her, her hands resting loosely in her lap. She felt lighter somehow, as though the music had lifted something heavy off her chest, leaving room for a quiet kind of peace. Lucas was still beside her, leaning against the wall, his arms loosely crossed. He hadn't said much during the last few performances, but Jocelyn had felt his presence like a steady hum just at the edge of her awareness. Now, as the room began to clear, he turned to her with that same soft curiosity in his eyes. "Do you want to get some air?" he asked, his voice low enough that it felt like it was meant just for her. Jocelyn hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "Sure." They rose together, weaving their way through the small crowd exiting the venue. Outside, the cool night air greeted them, crisp and bracing after the warmth of the room. The street was quieter now, the faint hum of the city softened under the glow of streetlights. Jocelyn tucked her hands into the pockets of her coat, glancing briefly at Lucas. He stood with an easy posture, one hand resting in his own pocket, the other holding a steaming cup of tea he must have brought out with him. "So," he said, his lips curving into a small smile, "did it live up to your expectations?" Jocelyn returned the smile, her breath forming little clouds in the air. "It surpassed them, actually. It's been a long time since I've felt, I don't know, connected to something like that. Lucas nodded as though he understood exactly what she meant. Music has a way of doing that, cutting through all the noise and just getting to the heart of things. She looked at him then, her brow furrowing slightly. Do you think it's because it's honest? Or because it makes you feel less alone? He tilted his head, considering her question. Both, maybe. Or maybe it's just that music doesn't ask anything of you. It doesn't need you to be anything other than what you are. It just gives. Jocelyn's chest tightened at his words. She wasn't sure why, but they struck something tender in her. That's rare, she murmured, her voice softer now. Most things in life don't just give. There's always expectations. Lucas's gaze lingered on her, his expression unreadable but warm. You sound like someone who knows a thing or two about expectations. She laughed a little, the sound more wry than amused. You could say that. My job is basically one giant exercise in expectations, making everything perfect for everyone else, no matter what it takes. He raised an eyebrow, his interest clearly piqued. What do you do? I'm a wedding planner, she said, the words carrying both pride and wariness. I spend my days creating flawless moments for other people's love stories. Ah, Lucas said, a flicker of understanding crossing his face. He took a sip of his tea, his next words gentle. But it sounds like you're not exactly sold on the idea of flawless. Jocelyn let out a quiet laugh, surprised by how easily he'd cut through to the heart of it. I guess I'm not. I mean, don't get me wrong, I love bringing beauty into the world, but sometimes it feels hollow. Like all the effort goes into the surface of things, and the real stuff, what actually matters, gets lost. Lucas nodded again, his expression thoughtful. The perfect picture, but no frame to hold it. She looked at him, startled by the simplicity of his words and how true they felt. Exactly. For a moment they stood in silence, the distant sounds of the city filling the space between them. Jocelyn glanced at Lucas, studying him in the dim light. There was something grounded about him, something steady, but also a sense of movement, like a current running just beneath the surface. She wondered what his story was, what had shaped him. What about you? She asked, her voice curious but gentle. What do you do? Lucas's smile was faint but genuine. I work with my hands, woodworking mostly, furniture, carvings, that kind of thing. But I dance too, not professionally or anything, just for myself. The mention of dancing caught her attention. That explains it. Explains what? The way you move, Jocelyn said before she could stop herself. Her cheeks warmed slightly, but she pressed on. There's a grace to you, like you're always in rhythm with something. Lucas chuckled softly, the sound low and unhurried. I'll take that as a compliment. It is, she said quickly, a smile tugging at her lips. They fell into an easy rhythm after that, talking about music, about the performers they'd just seen, about the moments in life that made them feel most alive. Jocelyn found herself opening up in a way she hadn't in a long time, her words flowing freely as if they'd been waiting for someone who would truly hear them. And Lucas listened, not just with his ears, but with the kind of presence that made her feel seen. As their conversation deepened, Jocelyn realized something else. Being around Lucas quieted the restless part of her, the part that was always planning, always anticipating the next step. Here, with him, she felt like she could just be. Eventually, the chill in the air became noticeable, and Lucas gestured toward a small bench beneath a nearby tree. They sat down, their shoulders brushing slightly, the world around them fading into the background. Jocelyn glanced at him, her voice soft. Do you think it's possible to find something real? Something that lasts? She asked, the question surprising even herself. Lucas didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked up at the sky, his breath visible in the cold. I think, he said finally, his voice quiet but steady, it's possible, but only if you're brave enough to let go of the idea of perfect. Jocelyn's chest tightened again, but this time it wasn't uncomfortable. It was as though something inside her was beginning to shift, to breathe. She looked at Lucas, and for the first time in what felt like years, she felt the faint stirrings of hope. The narrow dirt path wound gently through the trees, the sunlight filtering through the canopy above in soft, golden patches. Jocelyn followed Lucas in quiet curiosity, the hush of the woods wrapping around them like a cocoon. Every so often he would glance back at her, a faint, knowing smile playing at the corners of his lips, as though he anticipated the moment they would arrive. She carried no expectations, only a quiet wonder at his ease. The way he moved through the world like it belonged to him, not in possession but in harmony. "Almost there," Lucas called over his shoulder, his voice light as he stepped over a tangle of roots. Jocelyn quickened her pace slightly, pulling her jacket tighter against the cool breeze. "And where exactly is there?" she asked, her tone teasing but edged with genuine curiosity. He stopped then, turning to face her. The sunlight caught in his curls, and for a moment, he looked like he belonged to the forest itself, rooted and alive. "It's better if I show you," he said simply, his smile widening just enough to make her heart trip briefly in her chest. She followed him the last few steps, the trees thinning until they emerged into a clearing. Jocelyn stopped in her tracks, her breath catching. Before her, the world seemed to open up into something out of a dream. The orchard stretched out in gentle rows, trees heavy with blossoms that swayed softly in the breeze. Pale pinks and whites blanketed the branches, petals fluttering to the ground like tiny fragrant snowflakes. The grass beneath their feet was lush and dotted with patches of wildflowers, their colors vivid against the soft greens and browns. The air carried the faint, sweet perfume of blooms, mingling with the earthy scent of bark and soil. Above, the sky arched wide and clear, as if to make room for the beauty below. "Wow," Jocelyn breathed, her voice barely above a whisper. She turned to Lucas, her eyes wide. "This is incredible." His smile softened, his gaze sweeping over the orchard as though he were seeing it anew through her eyes. "It's my favorite place," he admitted. "When everything feels too loud, I come here. It's like the world slows down and I can finally breathe." Jocelyn nodded, her gaze returning to the orchard. She could feel it, the stillness, the quiet heartbeat of the place. It wasn't just beautiful. It was calm, alive in a way that felt intimate and grounding. She stepped forward, letting her fingers brush against the nearest branch, the soft petals cool against her skin. "Did you plant these?" she asked, glancing back at him. Lucas shook his head, tucking his hands into his pockets as he leaned against a nearby tree. "No, they've been here for decades. I just take care of them. Pruning, watering, making sure they have what they need. It's satisfying, seeing them thrive." His voice held a quiet reverence, a kind of devotion that made Jocelyn's chest ache in a way she couldn't quite name. "They're lucky to have you," she said, her smile soft. "Not everyone sees the value in tending to things like this." He tilted his head, his eyes meeting hers. "I think it's important to care for something even if it doesn't ask for it, even if it doesn't need you exactly. There's something honest about it." She nodded slowly, her fingers brushing another branch before turning back to him. "It's rare, that kind of care." For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence between them filled with the rustle of leaves and the distant hum of bees. Then Lucas straightened, a playful glint in his eyes. "Come on," he said, nodding toward the center of the orchard. "There's a spot you'll like." Curious, Jocelyn followed him deeper into the grove. They wove through the trees until they reached a small clearing. At its heart stood a sturdy wooden swing, its ropes tied securely to the thick branch of an old tree. The ground around it was scattered with fallen petals, and the light streaming through the branches above made the whole scene look like something out of a storybook. Lucas gestured toward the swing with a grin. "Go ahead." Jocelyn laughed, a sound that felt unusually light, even to her. "What, are you trying to charm me with your secret swing in a magical orchard? Is it working?" He shot back, his grin widening. She shook her head, but the smile stayed on her lips as she stepped forward. She settled onto the swing, wrapping her hands around the rough, worn ropes. As she pushed off gently with her feet, the swing swayed, the motion slow and soothing. Lucas stood a few feet away, leaning against a tree with his arms crossed, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You weren't kidding," Jocelyn said after a moment, her voice soft. "It's like the world really does slow down here." Lucas smiled, the warmth in his eyes unmistakable. "That's the idea." As she swung, Jocelyn felt something inside her loosen, like a knot she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. She glanced at Lucas again, the man who had brought her here, into this quiet, blooming world of his. And in that moment, she couldn't help but think that maybe, just maybe, The world had slowed down long enough for something new to take root. The sun hung low in the sky, its warm golden light spilling through the branches of the orchard. Jocelyn sat cross-legged on the soft grass, a stray blossom caught in the folds of her jacket. Nearby, Lucas leaned against the trunk of a gnarled old apple tree, idly turning a smooth stone over in his hands. The silence between them was comfortable, filled only with the gentle rustle of leaves and the occasional trill of birdsong. She watched him for a moment, the way he seemed almost folded into the landscape, like he belonged to it. But there was something else, too, something in the way his shoulders curved forward ever so slightly, as if carrying a weight she couldn't see. "Do you come here often?" she asked softly, breaking the quiet. Lucas looked up, his lips tilting into a faint smile. "Whenever I need to clear my head, which, to be honest, is more often than I'd like." His tone was light, but there was an undercurrent to it, a shadow that flickered just beneath the surface. Jocelyn tilted her head, studying him. "What do you need to clear your head from?" He hesitated, his fingers stilling on the stone. For a long moment, it seemed like he wouldn't answer, his gaze drifting to the expanse of trees stretching out around them. Finally, he exhaled, setting the stone down beside him. "A lot of things," he admitted, his voice quieter now. "Memories I can't seem to shake, things I wish I'd done differently." Jocelyn's brow furrowed, but she didn't press him further. Instead, she waited, giving him the space she sensed he needed. After a moment, he glanced at her, and something in her patient expression seemed to nudge him forward. "My mom used to bring me to an orchard like this when I was a kid," he said, his voice carrying the weight of something fragile, something long buried. "It wasn't this one, but it had the same kind of peace, you know? The same quiet. She loved it here. Said it reminded her to slow down and breathe. I guess that's why I come here now. It's the closest thing I have to her." He smiled faintly, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. Jocelyn's chest tightened. "She sounds like she was amazing," she said softly. "She was," Lucas said, his gaze distant, focused on a point far beyond the orchard. "But she had a hard life. My dad left when I was little, and she raised me on her own. She worked herself ragged just to keep a roof over our heads. I always thought one day I'd be able to fix all that, you know? Take care of her the way she took care of me." His voice trailed off, and Jocelyn felt the ache in his words even before he spoke again. "But I never got the chance," he said after a moment. "She passed away a few years ago. Cancer. By the time they caught it, it was too late." Jocelyn's heart clenched, and she shifted closer, resting her hand gently on the grass between them. "Lucas, I'm so sorry." He shook his head quickly, as if trying to brush her sympathy away. "It's not your fault. I think about her a lot when I'm here, about how much she gave and how little she got in return. And sometimes I can't help but wonder if I'm living in a way she'd be proud of, if I'm doing enough." Jocelyn studied him, her gaze steady. "From everything I've seen, Lucas, I think she'd be more than proud. You care for people. You care for this place. That's rare." He looked at her then, his brow furrowing slightly as if her words had caught him off guard. "And what about you?" he asked after a moment, his voice cautious but curious. "What makes you feel like you're doing enough?" Her lips parted slightly, the question striking a chord she hadn't expected. "I don't know," she admitted. "I spend so much time planning these perfect moments for other people, but I don't think I've ever stopped to ask what that looks like for me." Lucas nodded, as though her answer made perfect sense. "Maybe you don't need a perfect moment," he said. "Maybe it's enough just to be here, to feel what's real." Jocelyn's heart softened at his words. She looked down at her hands, at the way the sunlight danced across her fingers. "Maybe," she murmured, her voice barely audible. For a while, neither of them spoke again, but the silence between them was full, of understanding, of shared pain, of something unspoken and tender taking root. And as the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows through the orchard, Jocelyn felt herself beginning to hope, not just for Lucas, but for herself, for something real, something lasting, something honest. The afternoon sun draped the orchard in a warm golden haze, the light filtering through the branches in soft, flickering patterns. Jocelyn sat on the swing Lucas had shown her on their first visit, her fingertips brushing idly over the coarse ropes as she watched him a few feet away. He was pacing a small patch of grass, his brow furrowed in concentration and his lips pressed together in what she'd come to recognize as his thinking face. "I don't know," Lucas muttered under his breath, running a hand through his dark curls. "It's been a while since I've done it. Might be a little rusty." Jocelyn tilted her head, her curiosity piqued. "Done what?" He glanced at her, his lips quirking into a sheepish half-smile. "Dance. You remember I mentioned that I dance, right?" Her eyes brightened with interest. "I do, and now you're not getting out of it. You have to show me." Lucas laughed softly, shaking his head as he placed his hands on his hips. "I didn't say I was good." Jocelyn smirked, leaning back on the swing and crossing her arms. "You can't be bad if you have the kind of grace that makes walking look like choreography. Come on, prove me right." He gave her a mock look of exasperation, but relented with a chuckle. "Fine, just don't laugh if I fall on my face, okay?" "Deal," she replied, grinning. "But I doubt that's going to happen." Lucas took a deep breath, rolling his shoulders as if loosening them up. Jocelyn thought she saw something shift in him, the easy posture he carried giving way to a focused stillness, like he was grounding himself to the earth beneath him. Then, with a soft exhale, he began to move. It started small, just a step and a sway, his body finding a rhythm she couldn't hear but could sense in his movements. And then he flowed into something more, his feet gliding across the grass, his arms lifting and twisting in a way that looked effortless, natural. It was a blend of strength and softness, precision and abandon, and Jocelyn couldn't take her eyes off him. He wasn't performing for her, that much was clear. His focus was inward, his movements a language of their own, each step and spin carrying a quiet intensity. The orchard seemed to respond to him, the branches swaying gently in the breeze, the sunlight catching on the petals, drifting to the ground. Jocelyn felt her chest tighten, an ache blooming there that wasn't unpleasant but unfamiliar. She realized she was seeing a part of Lucas he hadn't shown her before, vulnerable, unguarded, and completely himself. And in that moment, she felt her heart tilt slightly, as if drawn toward him in a way she hadn't expected. Then, it happened. Mid-spin, Lucas's foot caught on an uneven patch of earth, and he stumbled. His arms shot out to steady himself, but his momentum carried him forward, and he went down hard. A sharp cry escaped his lips as he hit the ground, and Jocelyn shot out of the swing, her heart leaping into her throat. "Lucas!" she called, rushing to his side. He was on the ground, his hand gripping his ankle, his face twisted in pain. "I'm fine," he said quickly, though the tightness in his voice betrayed him. "Just landed wrong? Give me a second." Jocelyn dropped to her knees beside him, her hands hovering uncertainly as she tried to assess the situation. "You don't look fine," she said, her voice edged with worry. "Let me see." "It's nothing," he insisted, but when he tried to shift his weight, he winced sharply and sucked in a breath. "Okay, maybe it's not nothing." She shot him a look, equal parts concerned and exasperated. "Stay still." Gently, she reached for his ankle, her hands brushing against his as she eased them aside. The contact sent a faint jolt through her, but she pushed it aside, focusing on the task at hand. His ankle was already starting to swell, the skin around it reddening. Jocelyn bit her lip. "It looks like a sprain. You need to keep it elevated and iced." "It's fine, really," Lucas said, though his voice lacked conviction. "I've had worse." Jocelyn sat back on her heels, fixing him with a look that was equal parts stern and tender. "Lucas, you just fell trying to spin like a figure skater in the middle of an orchard. You're not walking this off. Let me help you." For a moment he hesitated, his pride clearly warring with the practicality of her words. But then he sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Fine, but I'm blaming this on the uneven ground, not my dancing." Jocelyn smiled despite herself, relief loosening the knot in her chest. "Deal. Now come on, let's get you over to the bench." She slipped an arm under his and helped him to his feet, his weight leaning heavily on her. He grimaced, but didn't protest as she guided him toward the wooden bench at the edge of the clearing. Once he was seated, she crouched in front of him, carefully propping his injured leg up on the bench. Her hands were gentle but firm as she adjusted his posture, her brow furrowed in concentration. "There," she said softly, looking up at him. "That should help until we can get you some ice." For a moment, Lucas didn't respond. He was watching her, his expression unguarded in a way that made her heart trip over itself. "You're good at this," he said quietly. "At what?" "Taking care of people." Jocelyn felt heat rise to her cheeks, and she ducked her head slightly. "I'm a wedding planner. It's kind of my job." "It's more than that," Lucas said, his voice warm. "You care. That's rare." She looked up at him then, startled by the softness in his tone, the way his eyes seemed to see right through her defenses. For a moment, she couldn't find the words to respond. Instead, she reached for the blossom that had fallen into his lap during the tumble, brushing it away gently. "Someone has to keep you out of trouble," she said, her voice teasing but her smile soft. Lucas chuckled, a low, quiet sound that made something in her chest flutter. "Guess I'm lucky it's you." And as the orchard settled back into its quiet rhythm around them, Jocelyn found herself wondering if she wasn't the lucky one after all. The sky had softened into hues of lavender and peach as the day drifted toward evening. Jocelyn sat cross-legged on the grass beside the bench, a makeshift ice pack from her thermos pressed gently against Lucas's swollen ankle. His leg rested on the bench, propped up on her folded jacket. The orchard was quiet around them, save for the rustling of leaves and the occasional chirp of a bird settling in for the night. Lucas was uncharacteristically still. His gaze fixed on the horizon, where the sun dipped low behind the trees. His usual easy charm had faded, replaced by something quieter, heavier. Jocelyn could feel it, the tension radiating from him like a coiled spring. He hadn't said much since his fall, aside from a few grumbled protests against her insistence that he sit still and let her tend to him. Now, as the silence between them stretched, she wondered if he was retreating into himself, pulling away even as she sat so close. "You didn't have to do all this, you know," he said suddenly, breaking the stillness. His voice was low, rough around the edges, as if the words had been sanded down before they reached her. Jocelyn didn't look up from where she was adjusting the ice pack, her fingers steady and sure. "You were hurt, Lucas. Of course I had to." She glanced at him then, her eyes searching his face. "Why wouldn't I?" He hesitated, his jaw tightening as if he were holding something back. Then he let out a short, humorless laugh, shaking his head. "Because most people don't stick around when things get messy." The weight of his words settled between them, heavy and unspoken. Jocelyn stilled, her hand resting lightly on the edge of the bench as she studied him. "I'm not most people," she said softly, the words carrying a quiet firmness. Lucas's lips twitched, almost forming a smile, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. He leaned his head back against the tree behind the bench, exhaling slowly. "I know that's part of the problem, I think." "What do you mean?" Jocelyn asked, her voice gentle, careful not to press too hard. For a long moment he didn't answer. His gaze lifted to the branches above where the last rays of sunlight filtered through the blossoms. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, as if he were speaking more to himself than to her. "You make it hard to hide." Jocelyn felt her breath catch, her chest tightening at the vulnerability in his words. She stayed silent, giving him the space to continue. Lucas shifted slightly, wincing as he moved his injured ankle. "I've spent a long time getting good at staying out of reach. It's easier that way. No one gets too close, no one gets hurt." He paused, his fingers brushing absently through the grass beside him. "But then you show up, and suddenly I can't seem to keep everything locked up like I used to." Jocelyn's heart ached at the rawness in his tone. "Why would you want to?" she asked quietly. "Keeping everything locked up, it doesn't make the pain go away, does it?" Lucas let out a slow, shaky breath, his hands curling into loose fists on his lap. "No," he admitted, his voice barely more than a whisper. "But it keeps it from spilling over, keeps it from touching anyone else." Jocelyn leaned forward slightly, her gaze steady on his. "Lucas, you don't have to carry all of that alone. Whatever it is, you don't have to keep it locked away." He looked at her then, and the weight in his eyes nearly broke her. There was something haunted there, something that had been buried for so long it had almost taken root. "It's not just one thing," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "It's everything. My mom. The way she worked herself to the bone to give me a life. The way I didn't see how sick she was until it was too late. The fact that I couldn't do anything to save her." Jocelyn felt her chest tighten, the ache in his words wrapping around her like a vice. She reached out without thinking, her hand resting gently on his arm. Lucas. She was the strongest person I've ever known, he continued, his voice cracking slightly. But she never got a break, not a real one anyway, and I kept telling myself I'd make it up to her someday, that I'd take care of her the way she took care of me. But then she was gone, and all I had left were the things I didn't get to say, the things I didn't do. His words hung in the air, heavy with regret. Jocelyn's fingers tightened slightly on his arm, grounding him, reminding him that he wasn't alone. You loved her, she said softly. That's what matters. And I'm sure she knew that, Lucas. I'm sure she felt it. Lucas's gaze dropped to the ground, his shoulders slumping under the weight of his grief. I hope so, he murmured. But it doesn't stop the guilt. It doesn't stop me from wondering if I could have done more. Jocelyn shifted closer, her hands sliding down to take his. His fingers were rough and calloused, but they trembled slightly under her touch. You did what you could, she said, her voice steady. And you're still carrying her with you, aren't you? In the way you care for this orchard, in the way you notice the little things, the details that most people overlook. That's her, too. Lucas looked up at her then, his eyes glassy with unshed tears. You make it sound so simple, he said, a faint, broken smile tugging at the corners of his lips. It's not simple, Jocelyn said, her own voice thick with emotion. But it's real, and that's what matters. For a moment they sat in silence, their hands still entwined. The orchard seemed to breathe around them, the soft rustle of leaves and the distant hum of bees filling the space where words no longer felt adequate. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world in shades of blue and gray, Jocelyn felt something shift between them, a fragile, tentative crack in the walls Lucas had built around himself. It wasn't a full healing, not yet, but it was a start. And for now, that was enough. The kitchen table was covered in papers, sketches, brochures, and a few coffee-stained napkins scribbled with ideas. A soft beam of morning sunlight filtered through the window, falling across Lucas's hand as he traced a line on the corner of a rough drawing. Jocelyn sat opposite him, her chin propped on her hand, watching him with a quiet smile that she couldn't seem to shake, his brow furrowed in concentration, and the tip of his pencil tapped lightly against the page as he considered something. You're going to wear a hole in the table if you keep doing that, she teased, nodding toward his tapping pencil. Lucas glanced up, his lips curling into a grin that warmed his whole face. And you're going to strain your neck staring at me like that, he shot back, his tone light but fond. Not my fault. You look intense when you're thinking, she said, leaning back in her chair. She stretched her arms above her head, the movement loosening the tension that had built up from hours spent brainstorming. Although I'm starting to think you're overthinking this one. Overthinking? Lucas raised an eyebrow, his grin widening. You're the one who color-coded an entire notebook for this project. Jocelyn laughed, feeling a blush creep up her neck. Okay, fine, maybe I have a system, but you're the one agonizing over the placement of every tree in the garden. Hey, the trees are important, Lucas said, mock defensive. They'll set the whole atmosphere. You don't mess around with atmosphere. Fair point, she conceded, still smiling. She glanced down at the page closest to her, a sketched layout of the property they'd been poring over for weeks now. But seriously, Lucas, I think we've got this. It's all starting to feel real. He leaned back in his chair, the pencil now resting loosely in his fingers as he met her gaze. For a moment, he was quiet, his expression softening. It does, doesn't it? He said at last, his voice lower. Jocelyn nodded, her heart swelling with a mix of excitement and disbelief. When we first talked about it, I wasn't sure if it was just a crazy dream. But now, she gestured to the table, to the mess of drawings and lists and plans. It's happening. We're actually doing this. Lucas's eyes lingered on her, and she felt the weight of his gaze, steady and grounding. You know, I didn't think I'd ever want to start over, he admitted, his voice quiet but deliberate. For a long time, I thought moving forward meant letting go of the past. Like if I tried to build something new, it would erase everything that came before. He paused, his hand resting palm down on the table, the scars on his fingertips catching the light. But with you, it doesn't feel like that. It feels like honoring it, like carrying it with me in a way that makes sense. Jocelyn's breath caught, her chest tightening at the honesty in his words. She reached across the table, placing her hand over his. "I think it's the same for me," she said softly. "I've spent so much of my life chasing this idea of perfect love, these perfect moments. But maybe it's not about chasing. Maybe it's just about creating a space for it to grow, somewhere real." Lucas turned his hand under hers, his fingers curling gently around hers. "Somewhere real," he echoed, the corner of his mouth lifting. "I like that." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The sunlight shifted, painting the room in warmer hues, and the sounds of the outside world filtered in, a soft rustling of leaves, the faint chirp of birdsong. Jocelyn let herself savor the stillness, the way their connection felt steady and unshakable, even in silence. Eventually, Lucas broke it with a soft chuckle. "You know," he said, his voice lighter now, "if we're going to do this bed and breakfast thing, we're going to need a name. Can't exactly call it Jocelyn and Lucas's crazy idea." Jocelyn grinned, arching an eyebrow. "Why not? It's honest." He laughed, the sound deep and unguarded, and she couldn't help but laugh with him. "True, but maybe we should aim for something a little more inviting." She tilted her head, considering. "What about something inspired by the orchard? It's where all of this started, after all." Lucas nodded slowly, his gaze drifting out the window as if looking to the trees for inspiration. "The Blooming Haven," he said after a moment, his voice thoughtful. "What do you think?" Jocelyn's smile widened, the name settling over her like a warm embrace. "I think it's perfect," she said softly. "The Blooming Haven, a place where people can come to slow down, to rest, to find something real." Lucas's hand tightened slightly around hers. "Then it's settled," he said, his voice carrying a quiet certainty. "The Blooming Haven, our fresh start." Jocelyn nodded, her heart full as she looked at him. "Our fresh start," she echoed, and the words felt like a promise. The soft scent of sawdust and freshly turned earth filled the air, mingling with the tang of blooming wildflowers from the orchard nearby. Jocelyn stood in the doorway of what would soon be the Blooming Haven's kitchen, wiping her hands on her jeans as she surveyed the room. The late afternoon light poured through the large windows Lucas had installed just 2 days ago, bathing the space in a golden glow. It was still a work in progress. Half-finished cabinets leaned against the walls, and the countertops were nothing more than rough slabs of wood waiting to be sanded. But she could see it now, the heart of their sanctuary. Lucas's voice carried from outside, low and melodic as he hummed a tune. Jocelyn turned and saw him through the open doorway, crouched over his latest project. His shirt was streaked with dust, the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, and his hands moved deftly as he worked on assembling a wooden bench. She stepped outside, her boots crunching softly against the gravel path, and leaned against the doorframe to watch him. "You're going to hum that song into my dreams at this point," she teased, crossing her arms with a smile. Lucas looked up, a grin breaking across his face. "What can I say? It's catchy." He tapped the side of the bench with a knuckle. "Besides, this beauty deserves a good soundtrack." Jocelyn laughed, shaking her head. "That's the 4th bench this week. Are you building enough seating for an army?" "Hey, you can never have too many places to sit," he replied, his grin turning mischievous. "Especially when people are coming here to relax and soak in the atmosphere. Trust me, they'll thank me later." She rolled her eyes playfully, but couldn't hide her smile as she stepped closer to inspect his work. The bench was simple but elegant, the wood smooth and sturdy, with intricate carvings along the edges. She reached out, running her fingers over the detail, and felt a pang of admiration, not just for the craftsmanship, but for the man behind it. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "You're really making this place come alive." Lucas looked up at her, his expression softening. He sat back on his heels, brushing a hand over his curls to push them out of his face. "We're making it come alive," he corrected. "This isn't just me, Jocelyn. None of this would be happening without you." She met his gaze, her chest tightening at the sincerity in his voice. "I don't know," she said, her lips curving into a small smile. "I'm pretty sure you'd get along just fine without my color-coded notebooks and obsessive planning." He chuckled, standing and brushing off his hands before stepping closer to her. "Maybe," he said teasingly, but it wouldn't be nearly as fun or as organized. He reached out, tucking a stray strand of hair behind her ear with a tenderness that made her heart ache in the best way. Besides, he added, his voice quieter now, you've done more than plan. You've made me believe in this, in us. Jocelyn blinked, her throat tightening as she looked at him. The orchard stretched behind him, the sunlight catching on the blossoms and casting soft shadows across his face. She thought back to the woman she'd been when they first met, tired, disillusioned, doubting whether she'd ever find something real. And now here she was, standing side by side with Lucas, building something new, something honest. We've come a long way, she said after a moment, her voice barely above a whisper. Lucas nodded, his eyes searching hers. Yeah, we have, he said, but I think the best part is that we're just getting started. Jocelyn smiled, the warmth in his words settling deep in her chest. She reached out, taking his hand in hers. I think so too. For a moment they stood there in the golden light, the orchard swaying gently around them, the world quiet and full. Then Lucas squeezed her hand, a playful glint returning to his eyes. Now, come on. You promised to help me finish the herb garden before sunset. Jocelyn groaned good-naturedly, but let him pull her toward the patch of earth they'd been working on earlier. Together they knelt in the dirt, planting the tiny shoots of rosemary, thyme, and lavender that would one day fill the air with their fragrance. Their fingers brushed occasionally as they worked, and Jocelyn found herself marveling at how something as simple as digging in the soil could feel so grounding, so full of promise. As the sun dipped lower, casting the orchard in hues of amber and rose, Jocelyn leaned back on her heels and wiped the sweat from her brow. Lucas sat beside her, his arms resting on his knees, his gaze fixed on the horizon. This is it, he said quietly, almost to himself. This is what I've been looking for. Jocelyn looked at him, her heart full to bursting. Me too, she said softly. And as the light faded and the stars began to peek through the twilight, they stayed there, side by side, dreaming not of perfection, but of everything real they had built together. The blooming haven was alive. Everywhere Jocelyn looked, there was movement, laughter, and the quiet hum of a place that was becoming more than just a bed and breakfast. A couple walked hand in hand through the orchard, their murmured conversation blending with the rustling of leaves. Two children chased each other near the wildflower beds, their giggles carrying on the breeze. An older woman sat beneath the shade of a tree, her hands gripping a steaming mug of tea, her face tilted slightly toward the sun. The scent of lavender and thyme drifted from the herb garden, mingling with the faint sweetness of apple blossoms. Jocelyn stood at the edge of the porch, her fingers wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. She didn't mind. This moment, this view was far more satisfying than any hot drink could ever be. The careful plans, the sleepless nights, the endless hours of sanding, planting, painting, and dreaming, they had all led to this. To a place where the world seemed to exhale, where people could arrive burdened and leave lighter, their hearts a little fuller. Behind her, the screen door creaked open and then shut with a soft clap. She didn't need to turn around to know it was Lucas. She could feel his presence before he even spoke. Hey, he said, his voice low and warm as he stepped up beside her. He held a plate with 2 slices of freshly baked apple pie, the golden crust glistening in the late afternoon light. His sleeves were rolled up as usual, his hands carrying the faint scent of wood varnish from a project he'd been working on earlier. Jocelyn glanced at the plate and smiled. Bribing me with pie again? Lucas grinned, leaning one shoulder against the porch railing. It works every time? She laughed softly, shaking her head. You're lucky, I'm easily convinced. She set her coffee cup down on the railing and took one of the plates from him, the warmth of it seeping into her hands. For a moment, they stood in companionable silence, watching as the day unfolded around them. Full house tonight, Lucas said, nodding toward the small cluster of guests scattered throughout the orchard and the gardens. Jocelyn followed his gaze, her smile softening. Yeah, she murmured. Can you believe it? People actually want to be here. Lucas gave her a look, one eyebrow raised, his grin teasing. Of course they want to be here. Look at what we've built. Her cheeks warmed slightly, but she didn't look away. It's not just us, she said. It's this place, the orchard, the trees, the quiet. She paused, searching for the right words. It's like it has its own rhythm, its own heartbeat. We're just lucky enough to be part of it. Lucas tilted his head, studying her for a moment. You know, you said something like that the first time I brought you here, he said. About the world slowing down. She smiled, remembering that day, how she'd felt herself begin to uncoil in the quiet beauty of the orchard. I guess I was right, she said softly. Lucas's hand brushed lightly against hers where it rested on the railing, and she turned to look at him. His dark eyes held a warmth that always seemed to steady her, no matter how chaotic things felt. You know, he said, his voice quieter now, I think this place feels the way it does because of you. She frowned slightly, caught off guard. What do you mean? He set his plate down and turned toward her fully, one hand resting on the railing as the other reached for hers. The way you care about people, Jocelyn. The way you see them, really see them. That's what makes this place feel like home. It's not just the orchard or the rooms or the pie, though the pie doesn't hurt. His lips quirked into a smile before softening again. It's you. You make people believe they're safe here, that they can be themselves. Her throat tightened and she blinked quickly, trying to stave off the sudden sting of tears. Lucas, she began, but he shook his head gently, cutting her off. You made me believe it too, he said, when I didn't think it was possible. You made me stop running from the past and start building something real. She stared at him, her heart full and aching in the best way. You built this too, she said, her voice thick with emotion. We did this together. I couldn't have done it without you. They stood there for a moment, the world around them fading into the background. Jocelyn felt the weight of his hand on hers, the steadiness of his presence, the way he anchored her even as he encouraged her to dream. And for the first time in her life, she didn't feel like she was chasing after something elusive or unattainable. She felt grounded, whole. The sound of footsteps broke the moment, and they turned to see a middle-aged couple walking up the path toward them, hand in hand. The man gave an awkward little wave, while the woman smiled warmly. We just wanted to say thank you, the woman said, her voice bright. This place, it's magical, exactly what we needed. Jocelyn exchanged a glance with Lucas before stepping forward, her smile widening. We're so glad you're here, she said, meaning every word. As the couple wandered back toward their room, Lucas leaned closer, his voice low in her ear. Magical, huh? Jocelyn laughed softly, nudging him with her elbow. Don't let it go to your head. He chuckled, picking up his plate of pie again. Too late. They stayed on the porch for a while longer, watching as the sun dipped lower in the sky, painting the orchard in hues of gold and amber. Jocelyn thought about all the weddings she'd planned over the years, all the polished, perfect moments she'd tried so hard to create. She thought about how much she'd longed for something real, something that lingered long after the flowers wilted and the music stopped. And as she stood there, surrounded by the quiet hum of the blooming haven, Lucas by her side, she realized she'd found it. Not in a single perfect moment, but in the messy, beautiful, ever-changing rhythm of a life built on love, connection, and care. This was her haven, their haven, a place where love wasn't a performance but a truth, raw and honest and real. And as the first stars began to prick the sky, Jocelyn felt her heart swell with gratitude, for the orchard, for Lucas, for every twist and turn that had brought her here, for finally understanding what love truly meant.